what's happening in the Sudan is I've seen a labor component. Definitely, we've played a clip of a very articulate, very young leader. But is this also on that same axis of obviously you have a repressive government. It's a government that has gotten a lot of attention in the West for being repressive, but not a lot of attention for, again, following a very similar World Bank, IMF-driven formula and generating a lot of inequality and a lot of hardship for working people.
That's right. That's exactly right. To the extent that people know much about the al-Bashir regime, it's largely in connection with either the genocide in Darfur or the war that had gone on with what is now the South Sudan. But there was very little attention in the U.S. media about what was going on within the Sudan, within the regime of al-Bashir. Every so often there were certain things like, was al-Bashir, covertly supporting al-Qaeda, things like that. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing in this current uprising, which in some respects people have identified as like a continuation of the Arab Spring, is a popular challenge to a repressive, an authoritarian, a neoliberal regime. And al-Bashir's response, interestingly, is to play to ethnic divisions within the Sudan. And one of the things that is quite frightening is al-Bashir warning people that if he is ousted, the Darfuris will take over, which is a plea to what in a Sudanese context would be understood as a racial ethnic contradiction. And he's basically saying to people that identify as Arab, which, Michael, could be a whole other discussion,
right.
That if they don't walk lockstep with him, that the indigenous African population of Darfur, most of whom are Muslims, will end up taking over and displacing them. So it's very ugly. But the opposition, at least so far, has not caved in. In fact, one of the interesting things I came across was a slogan from opposition rallies that in essence said, "We are all Darfur."
Mm. Wow. So what I find, it's depressing and horrible, but I'll be provocative. In a way, I like this analysis from Zimbabwe and Sudan because it brings two things to mind, and then we'll go to Amishal Cabral, who's the great contrast of all of this. But it seemed, one was Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, talking about how the age of humanism was over. He wrote that in 2016, and the sort of like he predicted before this wave of Trump and Bolsonaro, he really said, this is coming, this sort of fusion of authoritarianism and capitalism or neoliberalism. And what I think is fascinating about these dynamics in Africa, fusing like ethnic division with, neoliberal policies and authoritarian appeals, that would be part of a discourse several years ago that the sort of like, I have an Obama or Clinton poster on my wall and I want to go do some good in Africa kind of, benign imperialist colonialist attitude would say, oh, what a shame to see that there. Let's go over there and figure, and what really you see is like, the prototype of how to respond. First of all, that fusion and right-wing exploitation of that divisions are as old as right-wing politics. But in the specific modern context, what you're seeing prototyped in Sudan and Zimbabwe is what is happening in Hungary, the United States.
Yes.
It's different, obviously, but there is just a global pattern there. And this particular pathologies of places like al-Bashir are you know, they're not small relegated problems that you can pathologize or racialize. They're the roadmap of not dealing with capitalism that is coming to roost all across the Western and Southern hemispheric world.
So I generally agree with you, but I would nuance it a bit.
Please.
There is something that I would call neoliberal authoritarianism.
Right.
And then there is right-wing populism.
Right.
And so, and there is an overlap between these. I think that what we see in al-Bashir, what we see in Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, is charlatanism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, complete unmitigated opportunism and playing the different things, while advancing neoliberal politics. It's not what's different about that from what I'd call right-wing populism is right-wing populism is actually an independent social movement that is regressive, is irrational, and is completely inconsistent. It's not, although it is opportunistic, it's not opportunistic in the sense of simply a manipulation by the ruling class. It's a movement that is a movement against the future. Yeah. And so what we see,
oh, bless you. Bless you, Bill. You all right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got a cold.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. What we see in places like the Sudan are repressive efforts in order to hold in place a particular ruling group. Mm-hmm. And they are manipulating, as frequently happens, ethnic, racial divisions. What we see in Europe, I mean, we saw it in Rwanda in its extreme form in '94. What we see in Europe is the spread of right-wing populist regimes and movements that are revolting, the right-wing nationalist revolts against globalization. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that they are very inconsistent. Some of them are openly embrace neoliberalism. Some of them oppose neoliberalism. At least they claim that they do. It's a whole mishmash. What we have to understand, progressives have to understand, is that we have a battle against both of these forces. And that battle has to be fought on the grounds of the extension of democracy, the fight for tolerance. And by tolerance, I don't mean just, Rodney Kingism of why can't we all get along, but I mean tolerance in the sense of tolerance of racial, ethnic differences that exist, and that exist in many of these former colonial countries that were manipulated by Europe. So we're looking at a very, very complicated situation, and so what we see in the Sudan is al-Bashir understands the way so-called race has been played to divide the Arabic populations from the indigenous African populations. He is using that in order to retain power.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's okay. No, I always appreciate those distinctions. And I think that, yeah, right. I'll do, because this is part of my job, I'll bumper sticker it. We have to fight Macron and Bolsonaro. And they're both,
yes.
Yeah, they're huge problems, but they're both different. And we both need a distinct left track from both of them. And I love the frame of really the deepening and widening of democracy, because I think that does actually do a really good job of like enlarging the polity and dealing with difference, and then also the other and complementary track of democratizing the workplace and the economy so they can be synthesized and synergized. You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video, and you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.